I would welcome you again to today's webinar, Applying the SMCR, Tips and Guidance for HR Teams, presented by Ciphr in association with People Risk Solutions. Ciphr is a specialist provider of SaaS HR, recruitment, learning and payroll software, offering flexible, scalable solutions that cover the employee life cycle. Whether you're looking for a single provider for all your people-related software or to take a best-of-breed approach to integrated systems, Ciphr is here to help. I'm Cathryn Newbery and I'm Ciphr's Head of Content and Community. With me today are Andrew Pullman, CEO of People Risk Solutions, and Michelle McKinnon, the consultancy's Head of SMCR Practice. Welcome both.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Also joining us today is David Richter, Ciphr's Director of Marketing. Welcome.
Hello everyone.
Hello. We're just going to take a look at the agenda for today's broadcast. We're going to take a look at the FCA's goals for the SMCR and its application so far to banks and building societies, before looking more closely at the impact of the SMCR's extension to HR teams. We'll also be discussing the role of employee training and specialist HR software in supporting SMCR compliance and taking a quick look at functionality that's available in Ciphr. Our experts will also be taking your questions in our Q&A. Please send in your comments and queries using the chat function you can see on your screen at any time. You can also download a copy of our SMCR guide via the webinar panel, which should be listed under handouts. Just as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be emailed to you tomorrow. So don't worry if you're called away or if you missed something, you can catch it then. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Andrew now to kick us off.
Okay, thank you very much, Cathryn, and good morning, everybody. What I'm going to try and do in this next 40 minutes or so before we take questions is hopefully give you some tips and techniques from our experience of the senior management certification regime. We've been involved way back in 2015, seems a long time ago now, when the first 938 companies went through, mainly banks and building societies. And what I want to do first of all on this slide here is just a little bit of background of who we are, who I am, and why we're here to talk to you today. Basically, People Risk Solutions, we're an HR consultancy. We specialize in financial services and professional services, and the senior management regime is a special area that we focus on. Personally, I've been involved in HR and finance for over 25 years, worked mainly in investment banking and private banking. My last corporate role was as HR director for the capital markets business at Dresdner Kleinwort. Also worked for various other banks, mainly US banks, and set up the business in 2006. We got, as I say, involved with SMCR back in 2015 when it was brand new. Nobody knew what it was about, and worked with the City HR Association, who are a not-for-profit organisation who promote best practice in HR across financial services. And with a colleague, I got asked to co-chair the working group to come up with a framework for how can HR deal with the SMCR coming down the pipe. And we very quickly focused on the training aspects of this. And so we've been involved in training over 2,500 senior managers, certified persons and staff in this subject. And just as an aside, with my co-author Paul Aldrich, we published a book, Building an Outstanding Workforce, in October last year. So that's the credentials, and I'm here with my colleague Michelle McKinnon, who's worked in this space for a number of years as well, and we'll hopefully take you through why this is important and what it's all about. So I think the start point is, why have we got this regulation here in the first place? This is the question a lot of people are asking, and it really originated from the back of the financial crisis. One of the issues with the financial crisis was, the end of it was that a lot of people were dodging responsibility. A lot of people at the senior end of organizations were saying, oh, well, it's not my responsibility, it's the board, I'm not personally liable, etc. So Parliament quite rightly wanted to strengthen individual accountability as a result of that, and a parliamentary paper was produced in 2013 and given to the regulators, the FCA and the PRA, and they were asked to come up with some regulations to solve this particular problem. And so they came up with the senior management and certification regime. with the aim of creating a culture of transparency, clarity and support within the regulated firms. And so it's all about culture change. And any of you who've been involved in changing culture will know that it does take time. These things, you cannot flick a switch and suddenly everybody's doing the right thing. So this is a journey that started back in the financial crisis. It's been through implementation of the first round of the SMCR back in 2015, 2016, and we're now on to the next phase. So we're going from 938 firms, mainly banks and building societies, to one estimate is about 47,000 organizations are now being caught by this regulation starting from December last year, with the aim of being ready to go in December this year. So just to kick off, I think we have a quick poll just to see where you're at with this. So Cathryn, do you want to?
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Andrew. So our first poll for you is, how would you rate your compliance so far with the SMCR? Not great, average, fairly good, or excellent? Michelle, from your experience with working with firms, how are you finding they're getting on so far?
So, like the firms themselves who are caught in the new tranche, there's a huge variation. So we have some clients who have run at this very aggressively. Their statement of responsibility is already complete. Their certified persons are moving through the new certification process, and they've been very comfortable. The first certifications have gone through in January. We also have other firms who are really just asking the question, what shall we do? And they haven't got established plans yet. So I would say that a lot of people are maybe in the bottom quartile, in the variation of firms.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm just going to share the results now. So we have 18% of people said they're not getting on that great, 32% would rate themselves as average, and 43% think they're getting on fairly well. Just 7% of you rating your progress so far as excellent. So good job for you, 7%. Okay.
Okay.
We're going to move on now and talk a little bit more about how SMCR has been implemented so far in banks and building societies.
Okay, thank you, Cathryn. Yes, so the formal stock take was taken by the regulator, the FCA, last year to see how has it gone for the firms that went through it the first time. So they tried to learn some lessons from it. And there were several things that came out of this review. First of all, there were question marks about the actual impact on the culture. It was unclear, how things had changed, and that really encouraged the regulator to start looking much more closely now at organisations' culture, rather than just applying the rules. It was actually what actually is happening in the organisations. And they ran various events with a number of organisations coming in to try and explore that. So there's definitely a focus on culture from the regulator.
So if I can add, just recently they've really put emphasis on Me Too and looking at inclusion and diversity and whether or not the culture of bullying is being addressed within the organization. And this is a big change for regulation. It indicates that they are serious at looking at culture change.
The second thing was, and one of the key things here for this regime, is that senior managers are taking reasonable steps to make sure that people are doing the right things. And this again is an ongoing question mark and is a major focus for the regulator. There seemed to be, from the stock take that they took, a lack of confidence in the definition of what reasonable steps looks like. And although there was clarity around delegation of authority, they felt that there could still be some strengthening around this between the senior managers and the certified people that they delegated responsibility to. So one of the ways that you can demonstrate reasonable steps is to show positive action. And of course, I would say this, wouldn't I, but actual training of your staff to make sure they actually understand what it's all about, and being able to demonstrate to the regulator that you have done that in a constructive way is a good way of ticking that particular box, one of those boxes.
Yeah, And the FCA have signaled that they will not be providing further guidance in this area about what reasonable steps look like. So once again, it's for firms and the communities that they exist in to define what good looks like. And I think that's a big area of ambiguity.
Yeah. The other thing was they looked at the certification process. How was that going? And generally that was going reasonably well. As we're going to talk about in a minute, one of the things about the certification process is that it's quite administratively intensive. And again, that's one of the reasons we're here today, is because it's important that you use technology to help you with this. And a lot of that falls on the function of HR. Another factor was that they looked at in the stock take was the expectations of the non-exec directors within firms, because certainly with the first round, there was some concern from a number of non-execs, and I spoke to a number of them, one very senior in particular, who was called round to the regulator, because he said, well, I'm a non-exec director for an overseas bank, but if I cannot have control of things, then I'm not going to be a non-exec director anymore, because I cannot take the responsibility if I don't have control. So there's a few issues around non-exec directors and actually what are their roles and responsibilities. And one of the things I think you'll find with the implementation across the next wave is that it needs to be absolutely clear what the roles and responsibilities are of the NEDs. The next area was regulatory references. This is again really quite important for people, because when people leave the organization, you as a regulated organization have to provide a regulatory reference. It's laid out what that looks like, but it needs to include things like the last 6 years worth of information about the individual, whether or not there are any breaches or any regulatory issues or any disciplinary issues against that individual. And so the regulatory references, one of the feedback from the stock take was that it needed to be more consistent, and there needed to be improved timeliness and quality of response on those from firms. And then finally, the conduct rules themselves. And the FCA, one of the things that did come out loud and clear was that the FCA believed that the conduct rules training was not being sufficiently tailored for recipients. They weren't happy if it was just a tick box exercise without actual interaction with people to understand what it is.
I think in particular on that training piece, the FCA were not happy with the understanding, particularly of certified persons, about what a breach looks like at their desk and what they're meant to do. So we're talking about really bringing this learning home, so people understand, in my role, this is a minor breach, this is a major breach, and this is what I should do about that. So it's really looking more specifically.
So let's just look at a little bit of a refresher just on some of the key aspects of the regime. What does it look like, with a bit of commentary around it to sort of, and I don't want to teach you to suck eggs on this, because I'm sure you've seen this 1,000 times, but certainly my experience, having been on this subject since 2015, you can always come back to the basics to remind yourself about what actually is this all about. So if we look at the key components on this slide here, if you start in the center, look at it a bit like a target, if you like. You've got the senior managers at the center of this, and the senior manager regime and their responsibilities are critical. They are then supported by the certification regime and the certified persons, or I like to call it, in fact on this the color is of marzipan, I like to call it the marzipan layer. It's the people who are taking material risk in the organizations. And then you've got the conduct rules for everybody as well. So it's all about the conduct rules, and there are the 5 conduct rules, which no doubt you're familiar with. Just to refresh you, you must act with integrity is the first one. You must act with due care and skill and diligence is the second one. You must be open and cooperative with the FCA and the PRA and other regulators is the third one. The fourth one is you must pay due regard to the interests of customers and clients and treat them fairly. And then finally, you must observe proper standards within the market that you're operating. So these are fairly broad brush and seem fairly straightforward, but it's the interpretation of these conduct rules and the proper application of it that's really important. They have been around for many years under the old regime, but now they're coming to life. And one of the benefits of applying training to people is that you're able to use case studies around these, I think, to sort of make people understand what are these conduct rules, how does it work?
Yeah. And in the old regime, we found that the conduct rules were applied generally to the organization. The big shift here is this is now applying to individuals. And so we need to help individuals at all levels in the organization, again, understand what they look like at their desk.
And the key thing here, again, we mustn't lose sight of, this is all about individual accountability. So it starts with the senior managers who are personally accountable for the businesses that they run. And then that flows down through the organization, that individuals are accountable for what they do. So if we look at the various functions, all the way through to the board NEDs, but the key thing is that senior managers must have statements of responsibility. Now, in some of the smaller firms, it's not a requirement that they have to do that fully, but most organizations that we're talking to and working with are trying to aim for best practice and trying to go for the highest level of compliance, so that way they can ensure that they keep the regulator happy. If we look at each of the various audiences here, for the senior managers, just some key points. They still get approved by the regulator. So any of your senior managers that need to be appointed have to be fully briefed and then get put in front of the regulator to get agreed that they become senior managers. They have to have a statement of responsibility. They will have a statutory duty of responsibility to ensure that they take reasonable steps to prevent any regulatory breaches. They're held accountable for the areas, for the businesses they're responsible for. They have to document their decisions and delegations much more formally. So you should see, unfortunately, a bit more administrative support required around that. And also, those areas that we've talked about there are part of the 4 additional conduct rules that they have to abide by, in addition to the 5 conduct rules. So the 4 conduct rules are taking reasonable steps to make sure the firm is controlled properly, to make sure that relevant regulatory standards are met, that the delegated responsibilities are done properly, and that the regulator gets appropriate information.
I think for the managers that we've worked with, not all firms are required to do the management responsibility map. Most firms are doing that as their baseline so that they can then make sure that they've got everything locked in those statements of responsibility. So just to be clear, it's not a requirement. Most firms are doing it anyway. The other thing that I just wanted to focus in is that 3rd conduct rule for senior managers, the delegation. That's the one where firms are really having to do a lot of detailed work just to understand how that delegation works. One of our clients talked about the car park conversations, where you might have a conversation with your manager. He says, "Oh, David, I'd like you to do X, Y, and Z." What we're trying to do is formalize that process so it's locked into the firm's formal communications.
So if we look at thank you for that. So if we look at the certified persons, then the key change here is that the organization is responsible now for making sure that these people are certified every year. So as a minimum, they're certified once a year as being fit, proper, and competent. But in addition to that, they actually have to be certified every time a certified person is hired, every time they get promoted, every time they change jobs, they have to be recertified. So there's an ongoing process here, and this is one of the biggest challenges, I think, for the HR function, because largely this is an HR-driven exercise, although you do need to work very closely with the compliance function and some of the other functions. But that is the big change in the regulations, that firms are now responsible. So they're no longer approved by the regulator. The firm will confirm that individuals are going to be certified, and this again is one of the areas that we're finding with clients. Some firms are doing a belts and braces approach and thinking that actually it's better that we get people certified rather than not. And then there are other firms that are trying to do the minimum amount. We went to see one client the other day, and I said, well, how many senior managers have you got? They said, oh, we think we've got about 10. I said, okay, that's great. How many certified people have you got? Oh, we think about 3. And I said, well, hang on, how many people have you got in your organization? So they were taking a minimalist approach, put all the responsibility on the senior managers and not have very many people certified. I think they will be reviewing that, because certainly our experience is that you need to have, there are more people taking material risk in your organization. So that's worth looking at. Obviously, there's the annual confirmation that needs to take place. Firms need to take, and are expected to take, any corrective action where there are any breaches of the conduct rules. And the firms are accountable to the regulator on that. So some breaches will be minor breaches, and based on the compliance rules, may not need to be reported until the end of the year, but more serious breaches will need to be reported sooner than that, much sooner than that. And it's up to the firm to manage that process. You know, this is where we do, you know, have differences between different firms sometimes.
Yeah, especially looking at the regulated references which apply to certified persons. We're finding that firms are needing to be more tight about their capturing, for instance, patterns of minor breaches. Whereas in the past, those might have sort of just rolled off the table. Now the FCA are expecting annual reporting or immediate reporting of serious breaches. And those things also need to pull through to the regulatory references. That's a major change.
Okay. And then finally, all other staff. Now, the regulator states that there are some staff who don't need to be covered by the conduct rules because they are in administrative roles. They're not going to necessarily impact the business. In a lot of the clients that we're working with, the approach has been actually much better to have everybody covered by the conduct rules so that everybody's working from the same hymn sheet, rather than picking out people who don't necessarily need to be covered. So for instance, people in the post room, for instance, you know, they're doing an administrative job, they don't necessarily impact the firm, therefore you could argue they don't need to be covered by the conduct rules. However, you could also argue people in the post room have access to information about everything that goes on in the organisation, and therefore they actually should be covered. And I would argue the more rather than less. But I think this is a particular area where you have a group of people who would not have been involved in regulated activity before. Typically with the certified persons under the old regimes, they will have some sort of regulated impact. But these are people, so everybody else now is covered by the 5 conduct rules, which they have to abide by. And I think it's really important that these people get trained and understand what it's about, because this is where you could fall over. A common area where people can trip up here, and one area that compliance functions are very hot on, is data leakage. So leaking information about clients or confidential information. So this could typically take the form of sending an email to your home address with some client information on it because you're going to a client meeting tomorrow. You haven't had time to print it out, so you're going to send it to your home email address so that you can print it out when you get home. That's data leakage. And in some firms, we have one client who have a zero tolerance, and for that, people have been fired. And then we have other clients who go, oh, well, everybody does that, you know, so it's, you know, it's a slap on the wrist. So this is you can enter into a whole load of grey areas, but the bottom line is, I think all staff need to understand what the conduct rules are, what they can and can't do and shouldn't do in order to get into trouble. I think now we've got another poll, Cathryn.
Yeah, that's right. But this time we're going to have a look at how engaged you are as a HR team with your SMCR rollout. Are you leading the project? Are you a key player? Are you kind of feeling your way around the status in the project, or are you not yet involved? Andrew and Michelle, the companies you're talking to, what's HR status in those projects?
Well, as I've already said, I think it needs to be, it's a fairly critical part of this, but you do see variances. I'm still astonished to find organizations where HR and compliance still don't talk to each other, because I think there is a huge overlap, and I think if they aren't doing it, they should be working very closely with compliance. Ultimately, it's led by the senior managers, because it's they're the ones who've got their neck on the block in the first instance. That's not to say others will follow if things go wrong, but I would say HR is a critical part of this. It's to do, at the end of the day, it's to do with people. It's to do with your most important people in the organisation, and therefore, it's really important, and it's an opportunity, I think, for HR. If they aren't already at the top table, this is an opportunity to demonstrate how they can add value to the business.
And I think where we're finding clients who are going great guns, they understand that they need to build that silver chain of accountability from the top of the organization right down to the receptionist, and having that spread of strategic to make it so, and also that understanding of the business is something that I think uniquely sits within HR. So we're finding that if HR are not at least a key player in the team, that we're not seeing a lot of progress.
Okay, that's really interesting, because our results are showing us that about a third of you, 36%, say your HR is a key player in the team, but 32% say HR is not involved yet, which is kind of concerning. And Andrew, Michelle, you're going to cover a little bit more now why HR needs to be so involved, about how compliance affects every stage of the employee life cycle.
Just as an anecdote, we met with a client a couple of weeks ago who said that they had been given a set of tasks from their compliance team. They hadn't been involved in that planning, and so it wasn't in their annual plan or their budget, and suddenly a whole tranche of tasks have come through. So if only from the perspective of making sure that you can hit your targets, it's so key. But then there was also the set of recommendations that came through from compliance, which didn't really gel with some of the company's practices, some of employment law. So they had to really turn back the clock and get started again. This is why we think it's so important that HR are engaged early and at the top.
Yeah. So if we look at some of the impacts on the employee life cycle, I mean, there's no doubt this impacts all parts of the employee life cycle, and I think the certification process in itself has to happen at the onboarding stage, has to happen during employment, and then of course you've got the roll-off when people leave the organization. You've got the whole regulatory reference side of things, which you need to get right. Again, with regulatory references, because you have to include a whole load of information, when we were doing some research about a year or so ago, talking to one bank, for instance, and I asked the question, where do you get the information, the confidential information to do with breaches and to do with disciplinary results that you need to include on a regulatory reference? And he looked at me straight in the eye and said, "Oh, well, that's in our heads." Well, in our heads isn't good enough. And certainly if something goes wrong, that will definitely not be good enough. So I think, there needs to be a review within organizations of all the various aspects of the people life cycle to make sure that, there is a linkage to the whole regulatory side of things, the whole certification process.
And also we're thinking about, can you tell that story about the silver thread of accountability that goes straight from your senior managers to the people who are on the operational end, so that the integration of conduct rules into performance management, succession planning, learning and development is really something that is exercising a lot of our clients. The other aspect which we're finding now is coming up to fever pitch a little bit is having consistency in terms of breach management. So what do you define as a major and minor breach, and how do you address those consistently across the organization? Because that, of course, will drive your regulatory references, your regulatory reporting, and so on. So these things that perhaps existed in a slightly disconnected way in the past, and now we've got those conduct rules perhaps as a focus to make those processes more connected.
But even where the conduct rules seem fairly straightforward, and let's take the first one, as an example, integrity. You have to demonstrate integrity. Well, even something as obvious as that has different definitions across different organizations and different cultures. And in some of the training that we've undertaken over the last few years, I remember vividly one particular session where one particular individual was sort of outraged by the discussion we were having about the senior manager, and there were several cases. There was one in particular, the senior manager for one particular firm who was travelling into London, into Marylebone Station from Oxfordshire, but wasn't buying a proper ticket. He was buying an Oyster card, so that when he got to the London end, he just flashed his Oyster card, and eventually he was found out and ended up having to pay £40,000, I believe, for the back tickets that he hadn't bought, plus a fine.
It's a lot of commuting.
A lot of commuting, but the implication of this that caught, first of all, it hit the headlines and was in the front page of a number of tabloids. The firm then decided that there was clearly a lack of integrity from this individual, and so they fired him. And then the regulator got involved and said, well, this is clearly a breach of rule number 1, lack of integrity, and he's now been banned from working in financial services. And the discussion that I was asked about from one individual was, well, hang on a second, that's nothing to do with work. It's outside work. But then the problem was it was on the front page of the Daily Mail and the Sun and other papers, and therefore there was a reputational issue for the firm, and therefore the firm had to look at it and decide, what do we do? Clearly there was a lack of integrity, and there was a huge discussion about that. Now that was based on what would seemingly be a fairly obvious conduct rule, and even with that there was questioning about how it's applied. So if you take that through the whole list of conduct rules and some of the activities that people get involved in, it just, I think, brings home the fact that these things need to be discussed and need to be brought to life rather than just being a tick box sort of, exercise.
And this is also the integrity conduct rule is also the point of entry for the sort of Me Too efforts. The FCA have signaled that they're interested in the culture of eradicating cultures of bullying and harassment, and so this comes under the integrity rule. So this is something that has been, I think, a little bit of a surprise that the FCA have explicitly said it was of interest.
But I think that comes back to the overriding rationale for these regulations, which is to change the culture, and the culture is all about behaviour. And therefore, it's no good saying, oh, well, this behavior is, a manager is behaving badly, treating people badly, but it's nothing to do with financial aspects of the business. Well, unfortunately, yes, it is, because the regulator wants to know about bad culture where people are behaving badly, because what that then does is force people to make the wrong decisions and to do things incorrectly and improperly, which then has a knock-on effect. So I think in terms of this, what is the impact on the employee life cycle? That's why you have to look at the whole life cycle and think about all aspects and look at particularly the grey areas and discuss it.
Yeah, and just to pick up the point on enhancement of delegation from senior managers, this is something that came up, as we said, in the FCA stock take as a sort of could do better part. And this is really looking at, a lot of our systems are geared towards just measuring the output. Well, this is really about telling the story of the entire delegation and being able to answer the question about how is the senior manager monitoring that particular activity. So this is a big enhancement.
Another area in terms of communication and formalization, one thing that the regulator is keen to encourage is whistleblowing. Now, most firms or all firms should have some sort of whistleblowing policy, but the regulator is encouraging people, if they see bad behavior, things going wrong, things that shouldn't be happening in the organization, they are encouraging people to step forward. And so they've sort of reinforced that particular aspect. So that again is an aspect that you need to think about.
So when we talk about impact on the employee life cycle, it's every single stage of the employee life cycle needs to be sort of reconsidered and reconfigured with the conduct rules in mind.
Absolutely. So, you know, leading the implementation, HR has a key role, and it was interesting to see the poll where there are still a number of organizations where HR is not involved in this yet. I think that's probably driven by the and we're seeing this quite a lot. Some organizations where the senior management haven't quite latched onto the fact of the importance of this, or they're thinking, oh, we've got a year to do it, so we don't need to start until the summer probably, because we've got until December. What I would argue is the sooner you get to grips with this, the better, because it is so far reaching. It's got impacts on all aspects of what you do. And the later you leave it, the more intense the whole process is going to be later in the year. So I would urge HR functions to raise the flag on this. And as I said earlier, I think it's an opportunity for HR to actually engage with the business and actually help the business meet the regulatory requirements, because as we've talked about, there are various things that could go wrong. And as I always say to clients, you know, you've got employment law, which covers how people are legislated for in employment, and you've got regulations. But when there's a problem, and you've got the mismatch between regulations and employment, regulation will typically trump employment, simply because the downside of getting the regulations wrong is that you'll stop doing business. The downside of employment is that you need to write a large check potentially. So, you know, I think of those two bad options, the worst of the two is to actually cease operating. So, you know, that's the worst case scenario, obviously. You know, it's hopefully not going to happen.
And a couple of sort of difficulty points from our clients are first that, you know, at first balance, you see the little diagram of the three populations. You're like, okay, how hard can that be? It drives out a lot of complexity, and our clients are finding that in the integration between compliance and HR, even I just remember sitting down with the senior manager team. There were just 3 of them in the senior manager team. They took a look at their statements of responsibility with all 3 of them sitting around the table and said, wait a minute, is that yours or is that mine? And what does that look like? So we started at the top where we thought we had everything sort of nailed down. And, you know, then we looked at how that sort of shook down through the rest of the organization. So there's much more complexity. The other thing that we're noticing is that people are tending to take an additive initially taking an additive sort of perspective, by which I mean they're saying, and we'll add this, and we'll add that. And really what we want to do is be as conservative as possible, take a look at the fitness for purpose in your existing processes, and use those things that people are familiar with and confident of. This is not the time for a big shakeup. Most firms have good processes. It's about how you integrate those.
I think from a practical perspective, you know, we have to be real. And there are additional costs associated with this. And those costs typically will come out of a compliance budget and a legal and a risk budget rather than an HR budget. And we're seeing that quite a lot with firms, because it's easier to get money in an organization to cover regulation because it's something you have to do. Whereas within HR, you know, you've got a list of priorities of things that you would like to do. And often, you know, as an HR person, I know they're not necessarily top of the agenda. So that's where, you know, this is another reason why HR needs to work closely with the regulatory side of the business to get the funding to do the right things in order to tick the boxes and get things done.
But bear in mind as well that the funding of it is only one element of it.
Absolutely.
The admin time is going to largely, I would expect,
fall back onto HR.
Yeah.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
which is why, you know, getting technology to help you do that is really important.
It's very much HR responsible for making it so.
Which neatly leads us to the next poll.
It's almost like you planned that. Our third poll is, what technology are you using to support SMCR implementation? Are you using no technology? You're just on paper or Excel? Have you adapted your current system, developed your own system, have bought or are planning to buy specialist solutions, and this is a confidential response, you have no idea what you're doing, so we're not going to follow you up on that one.
No.
Andrew, Michelle, you speak to a lot of firms. Where are they at the moment? Are we seeing a lot of people still on Excel?
Well, yes. I mean, we've got one of our clients who shall remain nameless. When we started on this process, quite a large organisation. We were talking to them, and the technology subject came up, and they said, "Oh, well, we're going to build our own system, and we're going to integrate various aspects, and we've got budget to do it." Blah blah blah. 5 months ago, we spoke to them. And they said, right, well, we're still looking at the technology solution. We still haven't done it yet. And this is, you know, that was 2019, and they started in 2015. So I think it is a mixed marketplace at the moment. There's a lot of different things out there. But I have no doubt that, you know, that you need some sort of technology to help. I mean, interestingly, one of the aspects of when we were writing the book last year about the world of work today is the impact of technology is huge, and you know, you need to embrace it, and you need to use it to your advantage to help, particularly and this is a classic example of new regulations which require lots of administrative support to get it done. Therefore, you need something to help you do that, because you won't have lots of bodies.
Yeah.
And if you picture going into a senior manager with an armload of Excel spreadsheets, which he then has to analyze in order to make a decision, which puts his house and car on the line, I think you understand, you know, where we need to get a bit more sophisticated.
Sure, absolutely. Well, 42% of our audience today say they have no technology in place at the moment. About 21% have adapted their current system, and a quarter of you, I'm not going to name names, so they have no idea what they're doing.
Right.
So hopefully you'll have a bit of more of an idea after this webinar, because we're just going to have a quick look now at the usefulness of technology and training in supporting compliance.
Yes, so just very quickly, I mean, we've touched on training, we've touched on technology. We're going to hear more about the solution that you guys have come up with, which I think will be helpful. But, you know, the technology side of things, you know, things are being developed to look at the whole process or aspects of the process. Key things, you've got the compliance aspects, the compliance elements like breaches, etc. You've got the annual certification process, which is, you know, quite onerous. And then out of that, you've also got regulatory references going forward that you need to be able to produce in a systematic way. In terms of the training, I mean, as we've already touched on, the FCA expect trained staff to be trained properly. And this is an area that obviously we've been heavily involved in. So we've been working with the SMFs and the senior managers in terms of coaching and doing master classes for them. One of the challenges for the senior managers is, okay, how do I manage things differently? Now that I've got, you know, a much more focus on the business that I'm running, I'm going to be more interested in the regulatory side of things. I need to get more involved. What do I need to do? How do I do that? So that's what we've been helping them with. And then the certified persons, it's very much, you know, workshops and webinars, typically a 2-hour workshop to take them through what it's all about, but then also integrating some case studies in there so that they can bring it to life. As we've already touched on, you know, there are huge grey areas, and people need to sort of understand that and work their way through it, because it comes down to judgment at the end of the day. And then finally, all staff need help with the conduct rules. What are the conduct rules? And again, they need to have some case studies to explain to them, and so they can watch out for the bear traps that when they're wandering along in their day-to-day work. So I think systems and training really important.
Yeah. And on the training side, the reason we have such a list of different types of training is that, you know, this is all driven by the firm's existing culture. So what we find is most effective is actually understanding the firm's existing culture, then very rapidly building content around that, and then bespoke case studies so that, you know, in answer to the stock take from the FCA, you know, this is, you're driving your business from your desk. This is what this looks like from your desk. And that seems to be, you know, valued by our clients.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we're just going to ask quickly now, how are you planning to train your staff, or how are you already beginning to train your staff in relation to SMCR? No plans yet. You're running workshops, online training, or a mix of online and face-to-face training. So Joe, you said it's generally culture driven. Are you finding one preference or another kind of outweighing the other?
Well, we're mostly working with senior managers and certified persons at this stage in the process. And the strong preference there has been for face-to-face training, workshops, or even coaching with small groups of senior managers. We are looking at some sort of bespoke digital offering for the conduct audience, the wider audience. But even there, we're trying to look at materials or news you can use so that the managers can take those away, use those in their team meetings and so on, so we can make it bespoke. The online training we know is a low cost option. It doesn't appear at the moment to me meeting the requirement that the FCA set out in their stock take.
Okay, so the results we have now, 24% said they have no plans for training yet, 20% are running workshops, 28% using online training, and another 20% using a mix of online and face-to-face training.
So quite a mix.
Quite a mix. Nice to see that there's probably some thought going behind that about what's appropriate for their culture. So I'm going to give Andrew and Michelle a break now and hand over to David, who's going to tell us a little bit more about how Ciphr can support SMCR compliance.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cathryn. So as Cathryn mentioned at the start of the webinar, Ciphr develop HR and people management systems that help organisations to attract, engage, manage and retain their employees more effectively. As an industry, financial services is incredibly important to us. It makes up about 10% of our customer base. Pop up a selection of the customers that we work with in the financial services industry. This is just a small sample. And we've been fortunate enough to have worked with many of these firms who are included in the first tranche of the SMCR regulations back in 2016 to guide the functionality we've developed to help the financial services firms in the next rollout. Because Ciphr is highly configurable to an individual firm's needs, rather than give you a full demonstration of the functionality we've developed in Ciphr to help you comply with the SMCR, what I'm going to do is give you a really, really quick top-level overview. We're going to pop a poll for you to respond to now. If you would like a more in-depth demo with one of our consultants, you can request one using this form, and we'll be in touch after the webinar to arrange a suitable date and time with you. What I would say is that even if you are at quite an early stage of researching the tools that are available to help your firms comply with the SMCR, it's worth requesting a demo now, because as you might imagine, we're speaking with really quite a high volume of organisations each month at the moment, so our consultants are getting booked up quite far in advance. Okay, so moving on to the functionality in Ciphr that deals with the SMCR. The screen you can see now relates to the senior managers regime, and it shows how you can create new SMFs and assign responsibilities to them. There's functionality baked into this that would prevent you from accidentally assigning a responsibility to more than one SMF, although you can override this if you want to, for any sort of extenuating circumstances. Once you've assigned a responsibility to an SMF, they can then accept or reject this, and then Ciphr provides a reliable and robust way of reporting on who held which SMF and any associated responsibilities with point-in-time reporting. So if ever you have to evidence who held a particular senior management function or associated responsibilities on a given date, even if that was 5 years ago, with just a few clicks, you're able to report on the information you need. Something else Ciphr is then able to do from all of this information is then mail merge a senior manager's statement of responsibility with all of the information mail merged into the appropriate format. So whenever there is a change of SMF or their responsibilities, it's a significant time saving for you. The reality is that the senior managers regime only affects a small number of senior people in a firm, so compared to more junior positions, they're less likely to change their roles frequently. So while it's absolutely essential that firms record this information in a reliable and secure way, once it's set up, the admin burden on HR actually isn't especially great. This is very different to the certification regime. So if we just move on to the next slide, thank you. It applies to many, many more people in your firm. I think one of our customers that I spoke to, it was around about, well, it's upwards of 40% of their workforce fall under the certification regime. And it's concerned with ensuring that anyone who's in a material risk role is fit and proper to perform that role, from having the right skills and knowledge through to just being able to evidence honesty and integrity through background and credit checks and any other sources that are relevant. These checks are carried out at least annually. So not only does this affect a lot of employees, the number of checks and evidence required places a significant burden on HR to be able to keep up to date with this. This screen that you can see now, it shows how Ciphr is able to help this. So it's just an example of the records and checks that Ciphr is able to hold. Off the dates that somebody has been certified as fit and proper, you're able to trigger automated alerts to ensure that their certification is renewed in plenty of time. You can upload any supporting evidence that you require. On the right-hand side, we've just configured this with some pretty standard checks that you might want to include, but it's configurable to your firm's needs. So one of our customers, one of the checks that they do for some of their advisors is to listen into recorded phone calls. So the system can be configured to ensure that that's recorded appropriately. Once somebody's been signed off as fit and proper, you can use Ciphr to create their certificate quickly. We'll mail merge that information into a certificate for you to store for your own records and provide to the employee for their own records as well. And then the third thing that I want to touch on relates to regulatory references. So the bread and butter stuff is that, yes, of course, you need to be getting appropriate references from the people you hire. And if you're hiring into a certification function, then, as we've already covered, you need to be getting a regulatory reference from every one of their employers for the previous 6 years. What I think most HR teams are yet to cotton on to is actually how much of a burden this is going to become for them in the future when they're having to provide regulatory references for many of their leavers for every job change that they make over the next 6 years. To help HR teams manage this, we've developed our own regulatory reference portal whereby new employers can request a reference for a new hire. This request is then received by the HR team in the back end. And then once the HR team approve the reference request, the person who's requested it can then access the reference in a secure portal. So you're compliant with GDPR requirements as well. The other big benefit of managing all this within Ciphr is that because of all the information you need to provide for the reference is stored within Ciphr anyway, you can provide a regulatory reference in a couple of clicks rather than manually having to trawl through loads of data. So like I said at the start, that's a really high level overview of some of the functionality we've developed specifically for the SMCR. As you might expect for a people management system like Ciphr, there's loads of other functionality which we've not covered now. Some of it will actually be useful for the SMCR. So one of the points we were discussing earlier is about being able to evidence and improve the culture of a firm. So functionality like the case management tools that we've got available within Ciphr can certainly help with those aspects as well. So that's everything I wanted to cover in this overview. Cathryn, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have time to answer some of your questions now. We have about 5 minutes. If you have any questions for anybody on our panel today, please send them in using the chat function. I guess I have a question for you, Andrew and Michelle. We talked about 9th of December 2019 as being the date that the extension happened. But where's the deadline for getting this done? Is there a target that HR teams can work towards, or is it kind of a bit more grey than that?
Well, the obvious target is a year's time. At the end of December 2020 is when they're supposed to be up and running and have started to do the certification and be fully up and running. So I would aim for 9th of December 2020 as a good date, a hard date to go for. I think, like a lot of our experience from last time was, there's a little bit of latitude, but I wouldn't, I would be on it now. I wouldn't leave it to the last minute. The regulator is expecting people to have plans in place already and start doing stuff. So I would not sit back. I mean, Michelle, do you agree with that?
I completely agree with that. It's just so much stuff has come out of the woodwork for our clients who've already got their plans. That I would say, we'd hope to see that you've got your statements of responsibility agreed as a starting point now, and that you're looking at all of the implications of that at a minimum, because you've got the 9th of December this year. I know it's January, but it's not as long as it sounds.
I mean, one area that we didn't touch on, but at the beginning of the process that does throw up some quite fundamental questions is when you start talking to your senior managers, or they start working out what their areas of responsibility are, particularly if you've got overseas ownership of the business, you start finding people saying, well, actually, I don't want to be responsible for this. I want somebody else to do it. Or, do I really have to do this? I've even had somebody run out of at the end of a workshop for certified persons, going around to HR immediately afterwards and saying, actually, I don't want to be a certified person. I'd rather do something else. So it does throw up a lot of business issues, and it flushes them out. So the earlier you start having those discussions, the better, before you get into the processy stuff, which is down the road.
And of course, alongside that, you might need to be implementing specialist technology to help you do it. So you'd be managing a compliance process and project implementation, essentially.
Yes.
Yes.
This is not as straightforward as it looks.
No.
Yeah.
We're not trying to frighten you, we're just trying to be realistic.
Realistic,
Well, I think
exactly.
yes, and it's about being realistic. I mean, the realistic piece is that business, the way you do business doesn't change. Some of the people doing things might change a bit because of the regulatory questions, but essentially it's behind the scenes stuff that's going on.
Yeah.
But don't underestimate what's required.
There's a lot of complexity in preserving your culture, but formalizing some of those management actions, particularly around delegation, that seems to be a very complicated area for a lot of firms.
What can you tell us about how the FCA will be looking and assessing compliance post-December?
Well, the start point is that their interest at the moment is very much on the culture. So they'll be looking at, okay, they'll be asking firms, rather than in the past, there tended to be a tendency to say, well, tell us about the naughty boys and girls and how you're dealing with that. It's flipped completely over to say, well, now show us how you are reinforcing the culture of the organization. What else are you doing to make sure that people are doing the right things? As well as looking at what are the breaches? What breaches have there been? Have there been any? How are you dealing with that? How are you dealing with a certified person who has done a relatively serious breach? How is that impacting their pay? What is, a lot of banks, for instance, have to go into the FCA and go down the list of people with the breaches and say what they've done in terms of pay. I've reduced that person's bonus. They've got no bonus. They've done this, they've left. And they want to see how people are dealing with it.
And that information also needs to be included in a regulatory reference in the future, doesn't it?
Yes.
Well, some of it may well do, yes. Some of it may well do, depending
And
on
they're
what it
really
is.
looking for that silver thread of accountability. So throughout all your HR, your people processes, your compliance processes, are you telling the same story about how you're managing within your culture, for instance, breaches?
David, I have a question for you about the Ciphr system. Does it provide template documents that can be used to generate certificates, for example?
It doesn't, I mean, we're not really an advisory service, but you're able to upload your own template documents that you can use.
Okay, great. I think we've come to the end of our time now, so thank you everybody for sharing your expertise. Remember, if you're watching live, then the recording of this broadcast will be emailed to you tomorrow. If you want to discover more about Ciphr's people management and SMCR solutions or the services offered by People Risk Solutions, just check the relevant box in the exit survey, which will show on the screen once this broadcast ends. Alternatively, you can email us at info@ciphr.com and one of our team will get back to you. Our next webinar is about how to benchmark HR software. So if you're planning to change your HR software anytime soon, or simply want to understand if you're getting the most out of your existing system, you won't want to miss this broadcast on Tuesday, the 28th of January. Visit bit.ly/Ciphr benchmark webinar to register. We hope to see you then. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.